I'm going to do some housekeeping here real quick, if you all don't mind. Just bear with me. You know, the world is looking for a leader. And as we talk today, it's my hope that we will come to a conclusion, or maybe a group of conclusions, about that leadership that God intends to have in His body. You know, next week, Pastor Tim will be preaching a message to give you a heads up. It's called Me to We, and it's about the community. It's about the church, and it's about that we are the church, that we gather together for worship as the church, and that as when we have an understanding of what that community means, and we have an understanding of what God intends to be in and through us as a community of believers, we can make the proclamation, not I go to church, but that we are the church. And a part of being that church is being a shepherd. And as the world longs for leadership, we understand that I'm just going to tell you by way of illustration. Some of you may think, well, I really don't care. Which, by the way, let me explain this real quick. Some of you may be wondering, well, why I'm wearing a purple cross. My sister down here on the front row, Georgina, made this for me. She said, now you wear this morning while you preach. And I said, I'll try. I said, now it may start bugging me if I'm moving around and I'll take it off. She looked at me in the eye. She said, don't take it off. You need that. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but I know I need to hide behind that cross today. The world is experiencing a leadership gap. I don't know. Some of you know about HR, human resources, and the fact that in the world today, the companies, the major companies of the world are scrambling because they're finding that as their leaders, as their CEOs and their presidents die off or get too old and retire and take their big old golden parachute and land somewhere in Fiji. Of course, I wouldn't want to be in Fiji right now. But they land somewhere sunnier than maybe here and warmer than here. There's a gap in their leadership. And they're scrambling and trying to determine, okay, how are we going to handle this gap? And it's kind of interesting. If you read the research and you come to an understanding that a lot of them are looking other places other than the United States for that leadership of their companies. In fact, many of them are going to Asia. I don't know what that means. But we are a world in need of leaders. How do you understand that we are a world in need of leaders today? We know and we understand that as we talk about the lack of leadership that we see, in some ways we see that in our current political process. Again, I don't know where you land, and honestly it doesn't matter to me at this point in the morning, you know, where you land, to the left, to the right, to the center, above and beyond. But when we think about our political process and we think about the men and the women that often find themselves running for political office, and particularly running for the office of president, you know, you can look at that political process and you can look at the things that surround that political process, and we can draw some conclusions about who these people are, you know, based upon, you know, the speeches they make, but based upon their history. And, you know, there's a lot of commercials and a lot of stump speeches that are made, you know, where people are explaining their positions. But ultimately, we see a number of things, and this was illustrated, I think, really well at the Republican debate a couple of weeks ago. There's conflict, right? There's conflict. There's controversy. There's a certain sense of how do I say this without offending anybody? People telling a pack of lies just to get your vote. I'm just being real. People who are making promises that they know in their mind and in their heart that they will never be able to fulfill, but they know if they say it long enough and they say it loud enough, that there are people who will believe in their hope and their change and all of the things that they say that is going to happen if they're elected to this office, that someone's going to cast a ballot for them. Conflict, consumer and consumption of things. But there's a research group called the Leadership Forum, and what they have found, going back to this whole idea of the world looking for leadership, what they have found is that it's not so much there's not an availability of warm bodies to fill positions. There's not an availability of principled people who are centered on others' good and whose character reflects a desire to do good for this world and to do good for the people of whatever company they take leadership for. In other words, there's not a leadership gap, there's a character gap. So, the world is looking for leaders. There's a gentleman who writes for Forbes magazine. His name's Jeff Boss. It's kind of appropriate, isn't it? We're writing for Forbes magazine, Jeff Boss. He says this. He said, leadership development is too individually focused. The old paradigm that attributes culture and climate to a single leader must be replaced with a new one that leverages the environment to generate shared ownership and accountability. The secret, listen, is to spread leadership as far as possible throughout an organization, because only then will people feel empowered to make decisions, have a greater autonomy, and yield greater meaning from their work. The world is longing for leadership, and I'm here to tell you today that what this world, though they may think they're longing for a leader, what they are really longing for is a shepherd. They're longing for security, which a shepherd can bring. They're longing for the peace and the contentment that we find illustrated in Scripture over and over, where Jesus talks about the fact that He is the good shepherd. Where Psalm 23, which we'll talk about a little later, talks about the Lord is my shepherd. But the subject for today and what we're talking about today as we continue our Making the Shift 2016 series and talking about identifying these shifts that must happen at the depth of who we are. In the deepest part of our being, what we call the soul, making a soul shift, is that we are called to, and we find it necessary as followers of Jesus Christ, to make a shift from being a sheep to a shepherd. From being a sheep to a shepherd. Now let me just define that for you real quickly. If you're not reading the book or you're not a part of a small group, it's to understand that it's defined as a shift in influence from just following the crowd to being a leader like Christ. It's a shift in our soul, and it's a shift that is defined in our influence from just being a follower and a follower of the crowd to leading as Jesus leads. And so the question often comes, well, how do I do that? How do I make that shift? Well, let me ask you this first. Do you have someone in your life that when you look at that person, it may be how they pray, it may be how they walk, it may be how they work, it may be how they drive, it may be any number of things, but do you have a person, and I want you to think about this for just a second, do you have a person in your life that when you look at that person and you see them in action, you say, wow, I want to be like him. Wow, I want to be like her. Do you have that person? Do you have someone in mind? This isn't a knock on my father or my mother or anyone else, but the person that always comes to my mind when I think about that is my senior high Sunday school teacher. His name was Larry. He lives in Washington State now. He worked for the USDA. He was a scientist. And I've told the story before of me working with Larry for a summer when I was in high school, and we watched fruit rot. He was a fruit pathologist. Sounds exciting, doesn't it? Well, Larry got excited about it, and I can remember many times riding to work with him early in the morning to Fort Valley, where the USDA lab is off the interstate there, and he would be excited talking about, and his hands would be off the wheel. He'd be talking and be so excited. This is what we're going to do today, and and I'm like, please hold on to the wheel. He had a work ethic that was just unbelievable. He had a love for people. He had a desire to serve God, and he had a desire to lead and to shepherd. And where God placed him, not only in a Sunday school class to shepherd the heart of a young man like myself and the heart of some young men and women at First Church of the Nazarene in Warner Robins, Georgia, but he also saw that in his work he had the ability and he had the desire and he had what it took to shepherd a group of people who he supervised at his work. You see, his work was more than watching fruit rot. His work, his ministry, was to speak life into the lives of the people who worked with him, from the guys who worked in the field and hoed around the fruit trees and made sure the grounds were kept and sprayed for the various pests that would happen, to the man who was his assistant in the lab. It didn't matter who they are. When he looked at him, he looked them in the eye and he loved them and he spoke. And he shepherded. When there was a need, he spoke to that need. So let's talk a little bit about Jesus as the Good Shepherd. Because Jesus in John chapter 10, if you want to turn there, in verses 1 through 16, he makes a statement there. And all of us have heard this. We've heard it preached on. We've heard it talked about. I'm sure you've read it, where Jesus makes this statement. And he makes it unapologetically. He says, I am the Good Shepherd. Now again, I'm not here to impress you. I'm just here to share something with you. And that is this, that when Jesus stood in the midst of his disciples and whoever else was there as he was sharing these parables, and he made that proclamation and said, I am the Good Shepherd. He wasn't, straightening out his robes and, making sure he didn't look wrinkled and say, I'm the Good Shepherd. And it wasn't about quality either. It wasn't about the quality of his life. It wasn't about the quality of his teaching or the quality of his healing or the quality of anything. In fact, there's one place in particular where a man came to Jesus and he said, good teacher. And he said, do you remember? He said, there is none good but my Father in heaven. So when Jesus made this statement, the Greek word there is kalos, or kalos, however you pronounce it. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means, but pretty much everybody settles on is what Jesus was saying there as he was standing and he was saying, I am the ideal. I am the model shepherd. And if you want to learn what it means to be a shepherd, look at me. Look at who I am. Because the question comes when I begin talking about you making a transition, a shift in your soul from sheep to shepherd. A lot of fear and doubt, and well, I'm not educated enough, and I don't know enough, I'm not mature enough, I'm not this, I'm not that. How do I know? Where do I find guidance? What is it that I can do to become a shepherd pastor? Well, the glorious truth is that God doesn't leave it as a mystery for us to figure out. Right in the middle of this gospel, Jesus said, I am the Good Shepherd. Now let me show you what that looks like. John chapter 10, beginning in verse 1. Let's read. He says there, I tell you the solemn truth, beginning in verse 1, the one who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in some other way is a thief and a robber. So obviously that's not someone who's a shepherd. The one who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The doorkeeper opens the door for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. In verse 4, when he has brought all his own sheep out, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. They will never follow a stranger, but will run away from him because they do not recognize the stranger's voice. In verse 6, Jesus told them this parable, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus continued and said to them again, I tell you the solemn truth, I am the door for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will come in and go out and find pasture. Verse 10, the thief comes only to steal and to kill and destroy. But I have come so that they may have life and may have it abundantly. Then here's that statement. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not a shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and abandons the sheep, and he runs away. So the wolf attacks the sheep and scatters them because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. He runs away. Verse 14, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that do not come from this sheepfold. I must bring them too, and they will listen to my voice, so that there will be one flock and one shepherd. Sheep to shepherd. What does it mean? What does it mean to be a shepherd? How do we do it? Who is the model? Jesus. He said, I am the good shepherd. The first thing that we glean from this, Jesus says that my sheep follow me. Why? Because they know me. When they hear my voice, they recognize my voice, and so they follow me. Not as they would treat a stranger who they would flee from. They know me. They know that I am their shepherd. And the first thing that we have to think about when we talk about making this transition from sheep to shepherd is we have to know our sheep. You know, I want you to think about it for a minute. Think about where you work. Think about where you play and recreate. Think about where you go to school. Think about where the Lord has you at this particular time, at this particular place in your life. And it's an important step if we're going to make a transition from being a sheep, a mere follower of Jesus, one who just follows. And again, it's established. We're talking about those who are followers of Christ. He is the good shepherd. He is the model shepherd. But you become dissatisfied. You hear the voice of God, and God is saying, you must do more. You must step up. And what would the world look like if more of the followers of Christ would step up and say, you know, I understand. I'm not just called to be a sheep. I'm called to be a shepherd. And they begin to look at their co-workers. And they begin to look at their friends. And they begin to look at the people who are in their circle of influence. And those people that you rub shoulders with. Those people, you know, it's more than a Facebook relationship. It's more than every once in a while I see them on the street. I'm talking about some of the people that you may see every day. Of course, it begins as a father. It begins with my family, right? God has called me to shepherd my family. God has called me to lead my family. God has called me to do the things that are necessary. But as you think about this, you have to know who your sheep are. But because before your sheep know you, you must know them. And so you identify, in a sense, your mission field. You identify those people that not only that you see every day, but that you speak into their life every day. You identify those people maybe that come to you and even seek advice. You identify those people that God has planted and has placed in your garden, as it were, or in your sheepfold, and you say, you know what? I understand that God has called me into their life, and it's I know them, and they know me. You know, this is more than knowing someone's name. I confessed a few weeks ago that I struggle with knowing people's names, and I had about 7 or 8 people meet me at the door right there. What's my name? And my answer when people do that to me sometimes is I said, you know, if you wouldn't have asked me, I could have told you. There's something about the pressure. You know, I was sharing with Grayson earlier today when I said, you know, a lot of times people think that I appear just so confident and I appear, you know, just, you know, like I have it all together when, you know, I'm curled up in the corner over there in a fetal position with my finger in my mouth. Please don't hurt me. But we know. It's more than saying, hey, Bob, how are you? You know, Bob, you know what's going on in his life. You know what's going on in his home. You know, people as a pastor, you know, they often share their hurts and their pains. Sometimes it's on Sunday morning. Sometimes it's during the week. But they come and they pour their life out and they say, I need help. You know, those are the people that God is saying, you know, you're their shepherd. You're their shepherd. So you have to know the sheep. Jesus said, the sheep know me. And so I take care of them. You remember right there as he's talking about that whole knowing, he says, when the shepherd is there and the door is open and the sheep, he leads them out, he says, the sheep will find pasture. Psalm 23 says it this way, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. Or in other words, I have everything I need. And then it says this, the psalmist there, he says, he leads me to lush pastures. He leads me to refreshing waters. You may have a translation that says still waters or quiet waters. But the point is that once you identify your sheep, you understand those sheep need to be fed, correct? Because sheep have to be led into a place where they will not overconsume. some of you remember, if you've read your history and you understand that there was a time in history in the United States where the sheep herders were in conflict with the cattle ranchers. And they actually kind of went to war, as it were. They had, in the West, they had a huge conflict that some have loosely called, I think, the pasture wars. As these ranchers and these sheep herders were in conflict, to the point where they were shooting each other. Because the ranchers wanted the grass for their cattle, right, to fatten them up, so that they could fatten them up so they could lead them to slaughter to become someone's steak on their plate. And the sheep herders needed grass for their sheep, but because of the way sheep consume grass, they have to be on the move all the time because the sheep pull the grass up by its root, and a pasture has to recover a whole lot longer when there's a group of sheep on it than when a rancher has some cattle on it. And so, if a sheep is not led from place to place by a responsible shepherd, a sheep will eventually consume everything that is around it and will waste away and starve because they don't know any better. Sheep are pretty dumb animals. We had a sheep once. His name was Bart. And I can tell you this, if you came to the gate and you had a bucket in your hand that had food in it, and you opened that gate a crack, Bart would be running all over you to get to that food. Which is eventually why my wife insisted one day, after Bart had knocked her into the dirt one too many times, she said, "James, you've got to kill that sheep." And I'm not going to go into the gory details, but Bart became a meal or two, and I decided I didn't like, that meat very much after that. But they have to be fed. Then there's a need for leadership. Jesus more than once talks about that as the sheep who know him hear his voice, and as the sheep who find that they know him, what does he do? The scripture says there that when he has brought out all his sheep, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they recognize him. The unfortunate reality, and this is true in the church as it is in the business world, that this is where we focus ourselves all too often. We think, well, if someone is going to be an able pastor, they have to be a great leader. And what that means is they have to know how to strategize, and they have to know how to program, and they have to know how to plan, and they have to know how to manage people, and they have to know this, and they have to know that. And ultimately what happens is that pastors have become, in many ways, and again, I was under great conviction as I was praying and studying over this and reading through this and doing the things that are necessary to prepare this message. Because all too often, and I've confessed to you, I'm an extremely task-oriented person. And all too often, I focus right here. What does it mean for me to be a great leader? And I put my mind, and I put my hand, and I put myself to the task. And many times, I do that to the sacrifice of knowing and feeding. Because I have a personality that loves the administrative task and loves the leadership area. I like to plan. I like to strategize. I like to, talk about what does it mean to develop this and to develop that. But often we find ourselves bogged down in that. But we understand that it is for a shepherd to be effective, he must lead. But a leader is not necessarily a shepherd. Amen? A leader is not necessarily a shepherd. I've met leaders over and over in my life who could care less about people. They care a whole lot about a bottom line. They care a whole lot about an implementation of a policy. They care a whole lot about implementation of this and that. But the world and the people be damned if it means sacrificing something else. See, shepherds have to lead, but then shepherds have to protect. Jesus said the hired hand abandons the sheep. When the wolf comes and the wolf attacks, the hired hand does what? He looks at his own skin and he flees because the sheep are worthless to him. And God calls me, He calls you, as we identify our sheep, as we identify that flock that God has placed around us, and He identifies our ability and the way that we can feed them or bring them to food, and He identifies that way that we can lead them, because as sheep recognize a shepherd, they will follow your lead. Do you see that in your own life? Whether it's for the good or for the bad, there are people who are watching you and they are following your lead. And when you see people in crisis, how do you respond? Do you respond as a hired hand? And I'll be honest with you, there have been times in my life when I'm overwhelmed with my own crisis, and I act more like a hireling than a shepherd. And I see someone coming, and I'm thinking, man, that person, they have a great need that I can't do anything about. I got too much of my own stuff to take care of. And so I flee. But you know, when God gives us the heart of a shepherd, this is something I think we have to be on our face before God about. When God gives us the heart of a shepherd, when we identify or we see the need of the people whom God has planted around us, we're not moving away, we're moving toward them. Because we recognize that because we see that need, and again, this is one of those easy preaching, hard living, we recognize that when we see that need, that God has given us a discernment, not only of that need, He has provided somewhere in our life. It may be a word, it may be, as Pastor Tim talked about, it may be taking out your wallet and digging deep to help a family that has lost everything. They were renting a house, they didn't have renter's insurance, and my friends, when you're there, I've never been there, but I can imagine being in that position. But when you're there and you see the body of Christ surrounding you and meeting that need, you know what happens? There's a change. There's a change of heart. There's a change of mind as God ministers into that situation, because you have chosen and you have said to yourself, I discern the need. I have a way to meet it. It may be a few diapers. It may be a school uniform. Who knows what it may be? But that is a prime example of a way that we can shepherd people who are in need. So Jesus, he outlines it, he identifies it. He said, you know, a shepherd has to know their flock. Before the flock can know them, they got to know their flock. They got to feed them. They got to lead them. They have to protect them. Now, some of you are sitting here saying, you know, oh, Pastor James, I don't feel equipped. I don't feel available. I don't feel this. I don't know this. But central to that is that it's an attitude of trust. I was going to use some illustrations, and I ran right through them. That the legs of this stool, know, feed, lead, protect, but what sits on it is trust. Because you got to trust the stool to sit on it, right? And that's a two-way street. Because it begins, as Jesus, he further, illustrates this whole thing. He doesn't just call himself the good shepherd. He says, I am the door. And if you're going to be saved, if you're going to be everything that God intends you to be, you're going to enter through that door. And so when we seek Jesus, when we seek Him, we enter in through the door, and we're a part of that sheepfold, and we understand that Jesus is our shepherd, and we're seeking Him, and we're following Him. That trust leads us into adventures that we may have never expected. Now, there are some of you, and we talk about this as a staff. There are some of you, the only time that I look upon your face is on Sunday morning. The only time I look on your face is on Sunday morning. And when you're in crisis, sometimes it develops in a situation where people are unaware of your crisis because they have not had the opportunity to get to know you. And when you are in need of some extra food or some extra feeding, in a sense, as a part of the flock, sometimes that goes overlooked because the people who God has placed around you to be your shepherd are not aware because they don't see you. Are you kind of understanding what I'm saying? See, there's a thing that this whole shepherd-sheep relationship works both ways. If I'm going to be the shepherd of someone's soul, then I have to know more about them than where they sit on a Sunday morning. I have to know more about them than a name. I have to know more about them than that if you're like me, they have a couple of pair of pants that fit, and they can kind of rotate those pants from Sunday to Sunday. You understand what I mean? Because for a shepherd to know his sheep, there's an intimacy there. A shepherd sleeps with the sheep. A shepherd, feeds the sheep and knows them. Jesus said he knows them by name, and he knows exactly how many of those sheep are there. In other words, there's an intimacy and there's awareness there that is the sheep come into the fold. There's another illustration where Jesus talks about when there's only 99 and there's supposed to be 100. What does the good shepherd do? The good shepherd closes the door and goes and finds the sheep that has wandered away. But see, if the shepherd doesn't know that sheep, they're not aware that sheep is even wandering, that sheep is even doing. So what am I saying? I'm saying some of us this morning, we find ourselves in a situation where we need to connect. We need to show up. And we don't just need to show up, we need to be a part. And that's why we have small groups on Sunday morning and on Wednesday night. That's why we practice the kind of things that we practice, not so we can just fill some classrooms with warm bodies, but because we understand and we believe that if we're going to shepherd as God intends for us to shepherd, there's going to be other shepherds in this church. It's not just going to be Pastor James, Pastor Tim, Pastor Patrick, or Pastor Chrissy that are going to lead the program and lead this and lead that. God has anointed and God has called people who lead Sunday school and people who lead small groups who become shepherds. And you have to get connected there and begin to trust in the body. And begin to trust that we are the church. I don't just go to church. That we are the church. Let me close our time. I just want to read Psalm 23 for you. David, as he reflected on God as his shepherd, he had some great things to say, and I want it to settle in on us. He said, "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He takes me to lush pastures, and he leads me to refreshing waters. He restores my strength. He leads me down right paths for the sake of his reputation. And even when I must walk through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff reassure me. You prepare a feast before me in plain sight of my enemies. You refresh my head with oil. My cup is completely full. Surely goodness and faithfulness will pursue me all of my days, and I will live in the house of the Lord for the rest of my life." There's an intimacy and a trust there that allows David and allows us to find security. Because God He knows us. Pastor Patrick was sharing with me earlier this week. He said, I tell the teenagers over and over, you can fake me out from week to week. You can act like you're doing this and act like you're being this. But he says, I look at him and I say, but God knows you. You can fake me out. You can fool me. You can fool Pastor Tim. He's a little harder to fool. He looks you in the eye and says, what's wrong? But God knows you. Why does he know you? Because he's your shepherd. And he desires you to have what David recognized that he has and that he had and that all of us can have. I love that first verse. The Lord is my shepherd. I have everything I need. You recognize that God has, if you don't have it, he's offering all you need. All you need for life and for godliness. is found in Him according to His grace. Because He loves you with an unfailing and unsurpassing love and a faithfulness that even as David reflects at the end of this, that I know goodness and faithfulness, and it will pursue me all of my days. I don't know where you fall today. Or I should say, I don't know where you stand today. But where you stand, maybe you're just a sheep that's hanging out on the fringes. You're wandering off every once in a while, and then you wander back in. You might have moved in, being trusting the church in the sense of being connected and connected with a shepherd of your soul that God has placed to be there as an under shepherd of His, to lead you and to feed you and to give you security and protection. If that is the reality, praise God. But there are some of you here today, and I want you to pray about it. God is speaking to you, and He is saying, it's time for you to stop dilly-dallying and stop your following the crowd and just going wherever. It's time for you to lead. It's time for you to surrender yourself to me and say, I want to be a shepherd. I don't know how that looks in your life. Only God knows. But as we go to Him in prayer, I want Stan, if you come, and I think Stan's going to play Amazing Grace, and we're not going to tarry here long. But as he plays, if God, the Holy Spirit, has been speaking to your heart today, maybe you're like me. You're in a shepherding role, quote unquote. And you find yourself falling short. I know as I've prayed, as I've studied this week, I have said, oh, God, forgive me. And maybe you need to come and lay that before God and say, Lord, I recognize that I'm pursuing leadership, but I'm not really knowing the sheep you have given me, and I'm not really feeding. I'm not really protecting. Will you help me balance? Help me to see Jesus as the model, as the good shepherd, and see that become a reality in my heart, in my life. There again, you may be on the other end of the spectrum. You've been happy-go-lucky following, just kind of existing. But God is speaking to your heart and saying it's time for you to grow. It's time for you to step up. Wherever you find yourself. Let's sing that first verse. I want to invite you to come, lay your heart before God today. And just say, God, you're calling. Will you give me what I need and help me? He'll do it. We'll sing.